Pete Walker's book. There you go. Pete Walker's book. Complex Pete. No, it isn't. It's the one I was reading from yesterday, The Tao of Fully Feeling. And I was reading yesterday about how, let's see, grieving promotes vitality by decreasing self-destructiveness. So this is about childhood trauma and how adults are affected by it. There's millions of us walking around, probably about 1.5 billion. Hi, Black Lotus, nice to see you. I'm going to do a reading. I was reading astrology charts earlier, so now I'm doing my bit up for C-PTSD out there for people that need support and help. And what I'm going to be doing is basically reading about hypervigilance, how people are affected through childhood trauma and child abuse, sexual abuse, violence, and also verbal abuse. And anybody who's been through it, one is not as bad as the other, meaning that any abuse towards children is basically extremely painful for a child. So it matters not whether I'm not saying it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that we cannot compare. Childhood trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD is very serious, and it affects a lot of adults that are walking around in pain, in emotional pain, social anxiety. The anxiety pills being handed out in this world are absolutely huge. We have no idea what the numbers are, but generally people will go to their doctors and they won't divulge or put 2 and 2 together that the social anxiety they have and the panic attacks that they're having is to do with their childhood, because most people will write off their childhood because they'll say, well, it wasn't that bad. I wasn't beat as bad as Joey down the road. Oh, I didn't have sexual abuse, or it was only verbal abuse. And what happens is that people get something called arrested development. So myself, for instance, I would say arrested development, that if in looking after myself as an adult, I wouldn't ask people to help me when I needed help. I basically wouldn't reach out to people. So I became a loner and, withdrew from all people that I knew, and very much have lived, if I'm honest, the last 10 years on my own. And thankfully, social media brought me back into myself, because I began to verbally ventilate a couple of years ago on an issue that was quite traumatizing for me, through social media, actually, through groups, and where people were telling me that all I had to do was to release my pain, was to surrender it to God and let it go. And when people have had sexual abuse and they get, or violence and stuff like that, and they get into spiritual groups on Facebook, they're very much denied the right to grieve, and they're told that it isn't important, it's in the past, and you have to forgive your parents because they're your parents no matter what they've done to you. Which, looking back, it's quite comical that I allow it to upset me so much. Now I'm being a voice for those out there that need to hear this stuff, and the only way we're going to heal is by having psychoeducation. It doesn't matter what modalities we do, or how much therapy we have. If we don't understand what's behind it, then basically we're not going to, go through it. We're not going to make our way through the other end. So I'm going to read about hypervigilance. If you want to see what I read, I did a 40-minute video. You can go back to that yesterday, which is the beginning of this chapter 6 of The Tao of Fully Feeling by Pete Walker. His other book is Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, and all of the links will be below. And if you have any questions and you're too, feel concerned to comment on the live chat, then you can always go over to my Facebook page or send me a private email. Again, all details are below. And please share this out with people who may need it. So hypervigilance, let's go for this. He says, hypervigilance is the defensive strategy of becoming intensely watchful. Hypervigilance is a frozen, contracted, adrenalized state of anxiously anticipating hostility. In nature, it corresponds with the freeze response, the posture that animals instinctively assume when they cannot utilize their fight, flight, or response or combat or escape attack. So we have to realize that we're very much like animals in the sense that we've all got we're like animals, but we've all got the same response. So if a child is not nurtured and not loved and attacked, you see this happen to animals, and people seem to have far more compassion on social media. I see it a lot where people are posting things about animals being mistreated, but people who've had childhood trauma are not taken seriously because apparently it's in the past and you should be over it. So I keep repeating that, don't I? So he says here, animals and humans reflexively adopt the freeze response when their attackers or predators are too powerful to fight off or too swift to outrun. Many survivors were attacked so frequently in childhood that they were habitually hypervigilant, perpetually on guard, and painfully stuck in the freeze response. Children who are subject to ongoing abuse instinctively become hypervigilant, assuming rigid postures of intense observation and anticipation. They are like the cornered animals, anxiously trying to blend in and not be noticed. They shrink, contract, and become quiet and motionless as possible to avoid detection. Consequently, hypervigilance is sometimes also called the camouflage response. When we habitually shrink and freeze in hypervigilance, we damage our health through a chronic contraction of our body's musculature. All right. Hypervigilant tightening impedes the functions of and circulation and respiration and blocks the flow of qi. Qi is the term acupuncturists use to describe the body's circulating supply of vital energy. So if you imagine you've got a child that's full of joy and, you know, they're 2 years old and they've got all of this abundant energy, and then all of a sudden they start being sexually abused. I would term it as rape myself, but it's watered down by society for some reason. Anybody having sex with children is clearly raping them, in my opinion, but that's my opinion. And I don't know what other people make of it, but calling it sexual abuse is watering it down. Hitting a child and violence with a child and taking a belt to a child is also violence. And being wicked to a child with really nasty words is also beyond the pale. It affects children and they contract and they stop breathing properly and they go inward and they don't develop. They get arrested development. So we have, I'm in my 50s now, I know people who are my age who are just beginning to recover from their childhood because as they've gone through life and they've worked really hard, been successful in businesses or done whatever they've done, they've realized that that wasn't enough to make them happy or to surpass their pain. So they end up looking at the problems that are going on. They might stop drinking or stop smoking for health reasons. And then all of these emotions start bubbling up to the surface. And as a result of that, they end up with health issues. And as Carl Jung said, if you don't know who Carl Jung is, he was psychoanalyst he created psychoanalysis with Freud. That's why it exists as we know it. And because of that, you know, we've got to really look at those parts of our lives to become whole as a whole human being. And any denial or not being able to healthy anger or healthy blame or to, you know, not grieving keeps us, you know, we basically get to a point and then we're just dead inside. So verbal ventilation and getting rid of toxic shame, that it's not a subject that you should talk about publicly, is bull. And we can get to release all of that stuff because it's rife in society, and more people are needed out there who are going to stand up. We look at the Catholic Church of late, you know, the Michael Jackson case, which is, some people will argue he did, he didn't. The only people that will know that are the children that were in the room with him. And you know, I feel we've got a long way to go as human beings. We've got 1 in 3 boys, 1 in 3 girls, and 1 in 5 boys who are reportedly going through this stuff. And we've got 7.5 billion people on this planet. So I can think we can safely say that half the population have experienced this. So we need more people talking. Right, I'm going to continue reading. He says, The shallow breathing and constant tension of hypervigilance depletes us and leaves us susceptible to injury and disease. Most of us experiencing varying degrees of hypervigilance. Only in times of the greatest threat does hypervigilance manifest as a paralytic kind of frozenness. When we are less hypervigilant, we resemble the night watchman in a store with a history of break-ins. We spend long periods of time with our attention locked behind our eyes, anxiously anticipating danger. Hypervigilance tends to increase in unfamiliar situations. Many survivors are reflectively wary of all unknown people, particularly those who resemble their original abusers. So, example, as an adult, when I stopped drinking when I was age 46, I started having flashbacks and nightmares. And what I would do is that I wouldn't go to bed, because for me, that was my worst trauma, where my worst traumas were taking place. And so I would not go to bed, and I could not turn the light off all of a sudden. When I was drinking, I was able to do that. When I was drinking a bottle of wine a night, it was easy to just go to bed and pass out. But when I began to get healthy and I was no longer dissociating, all of the nightmares and flashbacks came up. I kept checking all of my doors were locked. I kept going around in circles, and it was then very apparent that I needed help. And it's so overlooked in society. And anybody looking at me, running a successful business at the time that I had for 29 years, and really, never being on benefits or having help from anybody, just getting on with it. Anybody looking at me would never have seen that deep wound inside of me. And I know it's just not me, and that's why I'm being public about this. Hopefully giving people hope that we can see this through, because there are ways to heal. So then he says, hypervigilance is a child's only means of protection in an abusive family. By remaining perpetually on guard, they can sometimes recognize subtle indications that their parents are entering the attack mode. This gives them time to hide, create a distraction, or shrink and make themselves into a smaller target. Sometimes it only provides them with enough time to get their hands up to cushion a sudden blow. I worked with several clients who were not even allowed this defense. They were forced to hold their hands at their sides while being slapped in the face. For those clients, disassociation was more effective defense than hypervigilance. When I contemplate my own history of hypervigilance, it seems that my parents' hair-triggering tempers banished me from my heart and forced me to take up permanent residence in my head. There, I intently watched my parents for signs of impending abuse, rigorously censored by my speech and movements, and desperately tried to figure out what kind of false self they wanted me to be. So you can imagine in the cases of sexual abuse, when a child, sees that it's coming, and, what terror they have to go through day in, day out, because in families where this happens, it does happen day in, day out. It's not a one-off thing. I'm sorry, Black Lotus, when I joined the army, the hypervigilance started again and destroyed my ability to sleep. Wow. Yes, I get you. Hypervigilance. I'm still hypervigilant, but at least now I know why I'm doing it, and I'm being able to curtail it. And I'm discussing it in therapy, in psychoanalysis. So at least I'm getting to objectify myself and have the courage to speak about it on social media and on YouTube Live, so that in helping other people, it's actually helping me heal. So I'm killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Then he says, let me see, I lost my place. He said, when I contemplate my own history of hypervigilance, it seems that my parents' hair-triggering tempers banished me from my heart and forced me to take up permanent residence in my head. He says, one of my clients recently discovered vivid evidence of her childhood training in hypervigilance and self-censorship. While watching a family film, she was appalled to see herself, a mere toddler, walking around the house, repeatedly smacking her own hand and decrying, "Bad girl, don't touch, bad girl, don't touch." When the camera panned on her parents, they laughed in delight, eagerly encouraged her to many encores. In a similar vein, I remember my surprise years ago when I noticed myself alone in an apartment saying, "I'm sorry," every time I dropped or bumped into something. I was outraged by this mindless habit when I finally became aware of it. My parents had made me so shamefully apologetic that I was apologizing to the walls and the floor. This realization eventually helped me to see how incessantly and unnecessarily hypervigilant I was about almost everything I said and did. So I've noticed for years, I used to say sorry to people for no reason. I'd not even bump into somebody and I'd say sorry, but I've trained myself now. I still do it occasionally, but I've trained myself, not to just blurt out sorry for no reason whatsoever, because clearly we don't need to do that. So I'm going to continue. He says, next page, looking out to avoid looking in. So this is what goes on in abuse. So the defensive posture of hypervigilance also serves as a distraction from emotional pain. Children numb their chronic fear and shame and loneliness by keeping their attention constantly focused outward. Many adult children are habituated to hypervigilance because their unresolved grief threatens to emerge whenever they are not on guard. Grieving releases the emotional tensions that keep us suspended in hypervigilance, allowing us to relax and become more agile in our bodies. 20 years of grief work has improved both my physical and health and my athletic performance. Although I'm nearly 50 years old and should be declining in my baseball skills, I continue to improve beyond any level I have previously reached. I hold my own and run the court for hours with men who are in their 20s. I believe grieving created this benefit by diminishing my performance anxiety. Performance anxiety is the insidious hybrid of hypervigilance, perfectionism, and emotional flashbacks that throttles and inhibits our ability to respond gracefully and spontaneously. Performance anxiety is stimulated by the unconscious fear that we will be treated as harshly as we were in our families if we misuse or falter in any way. And this is because, when we're told off and we're abused, we think that we have to be perfect, and then we pick on ourselves because we're not good enough. And that is arrested development also. So, where am I? Performance anxiety is stimulated by the unconscious fear that we will be treated as harshly as we were in our families if we misuse or falter in any way. One of the most tragic losses of childhood is that many of us don't participate in games, sports, dancing, and other forms of play because of unresolved performance anxiety. Before I grieved substantially, performance anxiety severely impeded my natural athleticism. I was so terrified of making mistakes that I often froze whenever I needed to act. When I was at bat or trying to catch the ball often went through me before I could respond. And when I did catch the ball, I'd often try so hard to make a perfect throw that I'd throw wild or wait too long to make the play. Fortunately, my performance anxiety occasionally abated when I played with friends, and so I continued to play. Whenever my hypervigilance was regulated, I think that says, let me see. He says, however, I made an inordinate number of miscues. Each error then drove my hypervigilance up another notch, and I contracted more and more, desperately trying painfully and inefficiently between such choices as to jump, dodge, pass or shoot, swing or take, run or hold. I was so locked up in my head that my body instinctive talents were rendered inoperable. So that's, you then begin to watch yourself in hypervigilance because you're thinking, are other people watching? What are other people thinking about me? And it's performance anxiety. I had that a bit when I started my YouTube stuff. I had all of these hang-ups about myself. And then, I had a few, I've had some funny experiences, but, the reality is that nobody's better than anybody else. We're all on this planet together. We're all born into the world. We're all going to leave. And we owe it to ourselves. Those of us who have been through abuse owe it to ourselves to have a quality of life that we never thought was possible because of our childhood. It doesn't mean that we forget everything that happened and that we don't, sometimes have memories and triggers. But what it does mean, with psychoeducation, we begin to lose a lot of the repeating stuff that happens, like nightmares. And in grieving and verbal ventilating and healthy blame and healthy anger, we do get more comfortable with who we are, and then we blossom into our own personality, which means that we can stand tall and put our shoulders back and, be a voice in this world for others that need it, because other people do need to hear. Okay, I'm back again with this. He says, before I grieved substantially, am I there or am I there? Let's go. He says, my worst performance anxiety occurred when there were observers or participants who reminded me of my parents. At such times, my hypervigilance escalated into fright, and my performance sometimes spiraled downward into a humiliating series of errors. In my worst disasters on the playing field, I became so completely hamstrung by fear that I sometimes disassociated and didn't even register that the ball was coming my direction. Once the basketball was bounced off my head and went ingloriously into the basket. On the other occasions, my performance deteriorated because I was lost in prayer, obsessively begging for divine intervention. Please, God, don't let him hit that ball at me. I promise I'll go to mass and communion every day for a week if I just don't have to make that error once more. My sports hypervigilance hampered me for decades with an exaggerated fear of dropping the ball. Because of this, I developed little of my full potential in sports. I never risked new moves, for I couldn't bear to make the initial errors that are requisite to acquiring new skills or perfecting old ones. My performance anxiety remained intact until I began using my anger to resolve it. So healthy anger resolves a lot of these issues. So if you're in any spiritual groups, it's great to be in them, but really know that healthy anger is something that we have to feel and express, and there is nothing wrong with it. Going on here, he says, my performance anxiety remained intact until I began using my anger to resolve it. I did this by quietly getting angry inside every time I felt afraid on the court. I barked back at the voices of doom and accompanied my hypervigilance. I blasted my parents for inoculating me with fear. I told my inner child that I wouldn't let them or anyone else abuse us for making a mistake. This is a lot of inner child work, this Pete Walker as well. He says, I used this technique hundreds of times before it allowed me to feel safe to begin to relax in sports. Many years of practice have rewarded me now with the ability to treat mistakes as learning opportunities rather than as catastrophes that deserve humiliation. My hypervigilance continuously atrophies as I grow older. And I increasingly connect with the relaxed, instinctive know-how of my body. Almost every time I play basketball now, I marvel at how much my reflexes take over and guide my performance. I can hardly believe how many missed shots I willingly weathered to become relatively proficient at shooting within 5 feet of the basket. So that's one example of what happens with going through child abuse, and one of the ways through it. So the book is The Tao of Fully Feeling, and I'm going to continue tomorrow with healthy hypervigilance. I've done a bit today. It's very late here in London. I was working on some astrology charts earlier. So for now, I'm going to leave it here. And if anybody wants, more information on this, I've got a ladies group over on Facebook that's just for ladies, anxiety, PTSD, over on Facebook. I've got my own page, which is public, which you can visit and have a look, and you can private message me there. And I've also got lots of information you'll see in the video below. So I hope that's useful today, and I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for watching.